On February 27, 1996, Pocket Monsters Red version and Pocket Monsters Green version were released in Japan for the Nintendo Game Boy by a little company called Game Freak. And, let's just say it went pretty well for them. This is the primordial event in the timeline that kickstarted what would ultimately become the most successful media franchise of all time, Pokémon. Which is short, it stands for Pocket Monsters. And boy, let me tell ya, this series of video games has experienced almost as many ups and downs in its checkered history as the frame rate in an average playthrough of Scarlet and Violet, the most recent entries in the main series. Now, under normal circumstances, I would have avoided such a scalding insult toward a pair of games that I actually quite like and respect, but I just couldn't pass up the opportunity to firmly date this video so that we may all look back on it fondly when I finally finish this little series of Pokemon retrospectives in 2076. To that end, lest my Legends Arceus review get delayed to 2077, I'll go ahead and cut the preamble short. Welcome to the premiere episode of my mainline Pokemon video game retrospectives. This installment will cover Generation 1 and its respective games: Pokemon Red, Green, Blue, and Yellow. I'm certainly not the only video essayist on YouTube to point out that the concept of Pokemon is authentically genius. The good people over at Game Freak essentially asked the question, what if we made a turn-based RPG, but instead of making the player fight and gain experience, we let them incarcerate a cohort of 6 magical creatures to partake in organized blood sport in their stead? It was a remarkably novel idea that, dare I say, shook the world. I think the main contributor to the massive success of these games was Game Freak's focus on maximizing playtime. The titular slogan that would very quickly achieve iconic ubiquity in geek culture, "Gotta catch 'em all," put a spotlight on the part of the game that went beyond the primary objective of the Pokemon League Challenge: collecting every species in the Pokédex. This certainly incentivized players to keep playing after completing the main story. After all, there were 151 of these lovable creatures to capture, and that's no small feat. Wait, there are 151 of these things? Well, screw the Pokédex, I want to play through the game again with a different team. And you can start to see how these games were able to generate so much value for its player base. Very few games during this time were able to achieve such a level of seemingly infinite replayability, and the ones that did were mostly arcade-style games like Tetris or Donkey Kong, where the entire point was to grind the same gameplay loop endlessly and just keep improving your high score with no end in sight. But Pokemon was different. Pokemon was a bona fide role-playing experience, complete with a grandiose adventure, fantastical elements, and the whole region of Kanto to explore. And Christ, it was all on the Game Boy! Nope, not this Game Boy, this one. Our favorite little brick that could from the roaring 80s. Oh, hey, it's a Bulbasaur! What's that, Bulbasaur? We should talk about the Pokemon designs? What a great idea! Okay, if I'm already running out of ideas for topic segues, we are in dire straits. Seriously though, I gotta give credit to my guy Ken Sugimori for creating these iconic creature designs. As much as I praised Game Freak's idea to elevate the whole Tomodachi gimmick to the nth degree by making 150 collectible creatures to befriend and make memories with, it wouldn't have worked if said creatures didn't look good. But lo and behold, they stuck the landing. If you're watching this video, you'll probably agree with me when I say that Pokemon generally strike this amazing balance between cute and cool. Pet and predator, if you will. These intuitively contrasting characteristics serve to cause a wonderful chemical reaction that allowed so many of these designs to stand the test of time and appeal to anyone that laid eyes on them. The meteoric influence of Pokemon would not have risen to the same scale without legendary designs like Pikachu, Charizard, Eevee, Meowth, Mewtwo, Rhydon, Mr. Mime! Mr. Mime. How is your home life, Mr. Mime? Okay, well, not every design can be a hit. Although, I can definitely relate to their methodology for a few of the subpar designs included in the roster. Whenever I had to meet a minimum word count in English class, I would write the same paragraph 3 times and then crack open a thesaurus. Dugtrio is just that, but without a thesaurus. And you know, if I had to figure out a way to cram all of that intricate data into a tiny square cartridge, I would probably have a moment of weakness and name the Seal Pokemon Seal too. You'll likely notice throughout this review that I'm generally more forgiving of the first generation shortcomings by virtue of it being, well, the first generation. This was their very first crack at the formula that we've all come to know and love, and honestly, I think they killed it, all things considered. I mentioned earlier that the bonds the player could make with their Pokemon allowed for a uniquely replayable experience. But that's not the only thing that set Pokemon apart from its RPG contemporaries. If you look at Final Fantasy, for example, another juggernaut of video game history in its own right, the adventure that the player undertakes doesn't necessarily entail a clear process of events. The short-term objectives along the way have no inherent obligation to serve as a microcosm of the ultimate goal. For a game like Final Fantasy, this style of progression is perfect because it gives rise to exciting twists and turns as well as unpredictability. Pokemon, on the other hand, goes for a more structured style of narrative, which is equally enjoyable in my opinion. From the moment you start your journey, or damn near it, not only is the final objective of defeating the Pokemon League communicated to the player almost immediately, but also the specific stepping stones needed to get to that point. In this case, the 8 gyms. This format creates an atmosphere not unlike competitive sports, where every step of the way is a concrete milestone ever closer to the eventual light at the end of the tunnel that is the Elite Four. It's hard to put the game down because you just want to go for one more gym, since getting 4 gym badges would get me halfway through, and then the 5th badge might allow me to catch up to my asshole rival, and the 6th badge is at Sabrina's gym, and I really want to battle Sabrina. I want to battle Sabrina. Let me put it this way. The progression in Pokemon games is what I can only describe as an extensively addictive sports season that culminates in a tournament arc. Can you see why I enjoy this series so much? Of course, the gym battles aren't the only thing to do on your quest to glory at the Indigo Plateau. Any self-respecting RPG needs a threatening villainous entity, and for Pokemon's debut generation, that villainous entity is, say it with me everybody, Mr. Fuji. No, it's Team Rocket. Team Rocket's goal is to steal Pokemon in the interest of gaining money and power. Yep, it's that simple. And honestly, I wouldn't have it any other way. Call me old-fashioned, but I think Team Rocket is one of the most effective evil teams in the franchise. Yeah, they don't have epic ambitions with existential ramifications like some of the later villainous teams, but sometimes the writers end up biting off more than they can chew with those types of villains, and the conflict ends up falling short. I'll elaborate on that in future retrospectives though. My point is that the height of the stakes is not directly proportional to the resonance of the story's conflict. Sometimes a generic mafia boss in a black suit who's also somehow a gym leader is all you need to get the players shaking in their boots. Uh-oh, looks like Bulbasaur wants us to talk about the battling system. Okay, I have to stop. So I would be remiss not to address the highly acclaimed combat system at the center of this whole thing. Having a sustainably engaging combat system is an absolute rite of passage for any RPG, and Pokemon is certainly no exception. Harnessing the power of the Aristotelian elements to progress through a fantasy world is a role-playing trope as old as time itself, but even as far back as Generation 1, we didn't just have the main 4 elements. There were 15 different types of Pokemon, each with their own strengths, weaknesses, resistances, and immunities. Half of the fun of Pokemon, at least for me, is figuring out how all of the different types interact with each other. And once you factor in that some Pokemon take on 2 types at once, choosing which moves to use against them becomes a fun puzzle that truly never gets old. Unless you're in Rock Tunnel. Of course, the battle mechanics still had some kinks to sort out, like Psychic being immune to Ghost instead of weak to it, which made Psychic types even more busted than they already were, or the fact that Special Attack and Special Defense were just grouped into one stat, making Psychic types unfathomably powerful, or how the chance to get a critical hit was entirely based on speed. Wow, Alakazam was a war criminal in Gen 1. But despite all of its flaws, I would assert that the gameplay in Red and Blue still holds up because the spirit of a wonderfully innovative battle system is very much present, and it can really be boiled down to a science to a greater extent than most other RPGs at the time, which is probably why there's such a huge competitive scene surrounding it to this day. Hey, so there's like a card game and an anime and a manga, and a plethora and a series of video games based on the card game, Stadium, and another anime, and another manga, Pokemon Unite. And when you introduce Pokemon Puzzle League into the equation, Pokemon Rangers, and another anime. Needless to say, this initially humble passion project, inspired by a man's nostalgic childhood memories of catching bugs in the wild, very quickly snowballed into a monstrous conglomerate of media that ignited a cultural mania the likes of which the world had never seen before, and won't likely see again for a long time. Unless, of course, it so happens that Valve decides to put half as much money as they spent on virtual reality ventures into researching what number comes after 2. Spoiler alert, it's not 2.1 because 2.01 comes before that. But then again, 2.001 comes before that. Wow, I guess it's a wonder they even made it past the first Half-Life. Numerical pedantry aside, there's clearly enough historical evidence to support Red and Green's incredible ability to captivate the world with a concept that truly captured lightning in a bottle. The lightning is the game, and the bottle is the Game Boy. You know what? You don't need me to make a metaphor. Everything's okay. I have nothing to prove. I should, however, bring attention to the elephant in the room of the actual logistics behind how these games were released in the first place. I wasn't planning on spending a whole lot of time talking about this, since everyone and their mom has already covered the history behind it at this point, but I can't help but feel that I would be betraying the spirit of this retrospective if I didn't mention the dual release nature of Pokemon's fateful genesis in the mid-90s. According to an issue of Nintendo Power, Shigeru Miyamoto, who was acting as the mentor to Pokemon's creator Satoshi Tajiri, was the one who suggested releasing Pokemon as two separate games, Red and Green in Japan, and eventually Red and Blue internationally 2 years later. It goes without saying that the motive here was to encourage players to trade with each other in the interest of completing the Pokédex, since there were certain Pokemon that were exclusive to one game and not the other. Or in my case, players were encouraged to connect a link cable from their Game Boy to their other Game Boy, inconspicuously carry out the exchange alone in their bedroom, and then cap off a trade well done with a self-inflicted high five. While we're on the topic of childhood memories though, you've likely noticed that I've mainly featured gameplay from Pokémon Yellow for this video. And that's because, well, it holds an incredibly special place in my heart. It was the first Pokemon game that I ever played all the way through, and I even emulated Ash's journey from the anime as closely as I could, to the point of actually preventing my Pidgeotto, Bulbasaur, and Squirtle from ever evolving. And yes, before you ask in the comments, it did take me 11 attempts to beat the Elite Four as a kid. Shout out to Charizard and Butterfree, my two fully evolved Pokemon. Pokemon Yellow would be the first example of a so-called enhanced version of the original duo, which ultimately became a pattern of production methodology that would continue for the following 3 generations. I find it a little strange that these third versions still have their own set of unobtainable Pokemon, but I suppose they still wanted there to be a reason for people to keep buying the originals. Yellow doesn't make a staggering amount of changes from Red, Green, and Blue, but it does offer a few satisfying improvements, such as better coloring, prettier sprites, and a complete redesign of Cerulean Cave. Not to mention the changes they made to make it more similar to the anime, like including Jessie and James, and allowing the player to have Pikachu follow them around and use all 3 starters on their team. And who could forget the best-kept secret of 1998, the infamous level 9 Pidgeotto that had a 1% chance of appearing in Viridian Forest. You know, even as I sit here talking about the mundane details surrounding the encounter table of a random location in the early game, I'm still overcome by nostalgia because whether or not the Pokemon community wants to admit it, virtually every aspect of Generation 1 is undeniably iconic in the most charming way possible. And believe me when I say that there are millions who feel the exact same way that I do. I'm willing to accept that from a critical design perspective, there is a strong argument to be made that Gen 1 is objectively the worst generation of Pokemon. However, when the contextual circumstances behind the history of these games is unraveled, I think that assessment starts to matter less and less. The reality is that on February 27th, 1996, Pokemon Red and Pokemon Green started something that would blossom into an unparalleled monolith that defined a generation. And the only certainty amongst the chaos of a revolutionary idea's creation was that the world would never be the same.